Jack Harper stared at the screen in front of him. His hands moved quickly across the controls as he guided the small scanning probe toward the strange ship. The ship was dark and silent, floating like a dead thing in the empty space near the nebula. It had been there for weeks, maybe months. Nobody knew where it came from or who was inside. The research vessel Wanderer had picked up the signal 3 days ago. At first they thought it was just space junk, but the scans showed something different. The ship was made with technology they recognized. It belonged to the Kravik, a species known across the galaxy as fierce hunters and warriors. The Kravik were not enemies, but they were not exactly friends either. Most humans knew to keep their distance. Jack was a xenobiologist. His job was to study alien life forms and understand how they worked. He had been working on the Wanderer for 2 years, studying samples and writing reports. It was usually boring work, but today was different. Today, he was about to board an alien ship that might hold answers to a mystery. The probe sent back images of the ship's interior. The lights were off. The air was thin but breathable. There were signs of damage, burn marks on the walls, broken equipment scattered on the floor. Something bad had happened here. Jack felt a chill run down his spine as he studied the images. Lieutenant Karen Boyd stood behind him, watching over his shoulder. She was the commanding officer, a tall woman with short gray hair and sharp eyes. She did not trust easily, and she did not like taking risks. But she trusted Jack to do his job well. "We should report this to the Kravik authorities," Karen said. Her voice was calm but firm. "This is their ship. They should handle it." Jack nodded. "You are right. But the nearest Kravik outpost is 3 weeks away. If there are survivors, they might not have 3 weeks." Karen was quiet for a moment. Then she sighed. "All right. You can go over and take a look. But you take Greg with you, and you stay in constant contact. If anything seems dangerous, you come back immediately." 2 hours later, Jack floated through the airlock of the Kravik ship. Greg Sullivan, the chief engineer, floated beside him. Greg was a big man with rough hands and a permanent frown. He did not like this mission. He had made that very clear during the entire trip over. The inside of the ship was cold and dark. Their helmet lights cut through the shadows, showing more damage than the probe had captured. Claw marks scored the metal walls. Equipment was torn apart, not just broken, but ripped to pieces. Whatever had happened here, it had been violent. They moved slowly through the corridors, checking each room. They found bodies, 3 adult Kravik, frozen in the vacuum where the hull had been breached. Greg scanned them with his equipment while Jack looked away. Death always bothered him, no matter how many times he encountered it in space. The cargo bay was at the end of the ship. The door was sealed, which was a good sign. It meant the air might still be good inside. Jack worked the manual release while Greg kept watch. The door hissed open and warm air rushed out. Jack's scanner beeped. The air was breathable and there was heat. Something inside was still alive. They stepped inside carefully. The cargo bay was mostly empty, just a few containers stacked against the walls. But in the far corner, tucked behind a broken crate, Jack saw movement. He raised his hand to stop Greg, then moved forward slowly. 3 small shapes huddled together in the shadows. As Jack's light fell on them, they flinched back, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Cubs. 3 Kravik cubs, no bigger than house cats, with soft fur and oversized paws. They stared at Jack with wide, terrified eyes. Jack's heart clenched. They were so small, so scared. Their fur was dirty and matted. They looked thin, like they had not eaten in days. One of them, the smallest, was shaking. Jack had studied Kravik biology, but he had never seen cubs in person. They were supposed to be rare, precious. Kravik did not have many children, and they protected them fiercely. These cubs had no protection now. Their parents were dead, their ship was dead, and they were alone in the cold darkness of space. "We need to get them out of here," Jack said quietly. Greg came up beside him and looked at the cubs. His frown deepened. "Are you crazy? Those are Kravik. They might be small now, but they will grow up to be dangerous. We should leave them and call their people." Jack turned to look at Greg. "They are children, Greg. Look at them. They are starving and scared. The Kravik authorities are 3 weeks away. These cubs will be dead in 3 days if we leave them here." Greg was quiet. He looked at the cubs again, then at Jack. Finally, he shook his head. "Karen is going to kill you for this." "Probably," Jack agreed. "But I can live with that." Getting the cubs back to the Wanderer was not easy. They did not want to be touched. When Jack tried to pick one up, it hissed and swiped at him with tiny claws. The claws were sharp enough to scratch his glove. Jack pulled back and thought for a moment. Then he took off his outer jacket and spread it on the floor. Slowly, carefully, he pushed it toward the cubs. The cubs sniffed the jacket. One of them, the bravest, stepped onto it. The fabric was warm from Jack's body heat. The cub seemed to like that. It sat down on the jacket and looked at its siblings. After a moment, the other two joined it. They huddled together on the jacket, seeking warmth and comfort. Jack carefully wrapped the jacket around them, creating a bundle. The cubs protested at first, mewing and squirming, but the warmth and darkness of the jacket seemed to calm them. They stopped fighting and went still. Jack picked up the bundle gently and held it close to his chest. He could feel the cubs trembling inside. "It is okay," he whispered. "You are safe now. I promise." The trip back to the Wanderer took an hour. Jack held the cubs the entire time, talking to them softly even though they could not understand his words. When they arrived, Karen was waiting in the airlock. Her expression was not happy. She looked at the bundle in Jack's arms. "Tell me those are not what I think they are." Jack met her eyes. "They are Kravik cubs, orphans. They need help." Karen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she opened them again. "Get them to the cargo hold. Set up whatever they need. But Jack, if this goes wrong, it is on you." Jack nodded. "I understand." The cargo hold became the cubs' new home. Jack worked for hours to make it comfortable. He adjusted the temperature to match the Kravik homeworld. He set up soft bedding in one corner and created a hiding spot where the cubs could feel safe. Dr. Helen Price, the ship's medical officer, helped him research Kravik nutritional needs. They mixed up a special food paste that should work for young cubs. When Jack opened the jacket, the cubs scrambled out and immediately ran to the darkest corner of the room. They pressed against each other, their eyes huge and scared. Jack put the food down and backed away, giving them space. Then he sat down and waited. For 2 hours, the cubs did not move. They just stared at him, watching his every move. Jack stayed still, barely breathing. Finally, hunger won. The smallest cub crept forward, nose twitching as it smelled the food. It took a tiny bite, then another. Soon all three were eating, though they kept glancing at Jack nervously. That night, Jack tried to sleep in his own quarters, but he kept thinking about the cubs alone in the cargo hold, scared and confused in a strange place. After an hour of tossing and turning, he gave up. He grabbed a blanket and went back to the cargo hold. He would sleep there, he decided. At least then he could watch over them. When he entered, the cubs were pacing. They moved back and forth across the room, their small paws making soft sounds on the metal floor. They looked exhausted, but they did not sleep. They just paced and paced as if rest was impossible. Jack settled into a corner and watched them, his heart heavy with concern. Something was very wrong, but he did not yet know what. 3 days passed, and the cubs still did not sleep properly. Jack watched them constantly, taking notes and trying to understand what was wrong. They would close their eyes for a few minutes, then jerk awake with small cries of distress. They paced endlessly, their little bodies moving in circles around the cargo hold. Their eyes grew dull with exhaustion. Their movements became slower, less coordinated. Jack gave them names to make it easier to tell them apart. The smallest one, the first to eat, he called Pip. The middle one, who always seemed to be watching and alert, became Scout. The largest, with darker fur and a fierce look in her eyes, he named Ember. The names felt right somehow, personal. They were not just specimens to study anymore. They were individuals, each with their own personality. Pip worried Jack the most. The little cub was clearly the weakest. He stumbled when he walked, and his breathing was too fast. Dr. Helen came to check on them every day. She ran scans and took samples, her expression growing more concerned each time. On the 4th day, Helen pulled Jack aside after her examination. Her face was serious. "Jack, we have a problem. These cubs are not getting the rest they need. Their stress hormones are extremely high, and their immune systems are starting to fail. If they do not sleep soon, really sleep, they will die." Jack felt his stomach drop. "What can we do?" "I have tried everything. The temperature is right. The food is right. They have soft bedding and a safe space. Why will they not sleep?" Helen shook her head. "I have been reading about Kravik biology. Cubs this young need something we cannot give them. They need their pack. In the wild, Kravik cubs sleep surrounded by adults. The adults form a protective circle around them. It makes the cubs feel safe. Without that, Their instincts tell them they are in constant danger. They cannot relax enough to enter deep sleep. Jack looked through the window at the three small forms pacing in their endless circle. So what do? We cannot become Kravik adults. I do not know, Helen said quietly. I am sorry, Jack. I wish I had a better answer. That night, Jack sat in the cargo hold with his computer, reading everything he could find about Kravik behavior and biology. The Galactic database had plenty of information about adult Kravik, their hunting techniques, their warrior culture, their military capabilities. But information about cubs was limited. The Kravik were private about their young, protective. They did not share much with outsiders. Jack found one research paper written by a Kravik scientist about cub development. The language was formal and difficult to understand, but he read it carefully. The paper described something called den sleep. It was a special type of sleep that cubs needed to grow properly. During den sleep, cubs would pile together with their family members, creating what the paper called a den pile. The warmth and physical contact were essential, not just for temperature regulation but for emotional security. The paper explained that cubs could sense threats even while sleeping. If predators approached, the adult Kravik would wake first, alerting the cubs. This system allowed cubs to truly rest, knowing that someone stronger was watching over them. Without adults present, cubs remained in a state of hypervigilance, unable to achieve the deep rest their growing bodies required. Jack closed his computer and looked at the cubs. They had finally stopped pacing and were huddled together in their corner. But even now their eyes were open, darting around nervously. Scout's ear twitched at every sound. Ember's tail lashed back and forth. Pip simply looked tired, so tired that Jack worried he might collapse. An idea began to form in Jack's mind. It was probably crazy. It definitely went against every safety protocol, but desperate times called for desperate measures. He stood up and walked to the storage locker. Inside, he found what he was looking for, a large thermal blanket, the kind used for emergency situations. It was designed to retain heat and provide insulation in extreme cold. Jack took the blanket and sat down on the floor, about 5 feet away from the cubs. They watched him with wary eyes. He spread the blanket across his lap, making sure it was warm and comfortable. Then he waited. He did not move, did not speak. He just sat there, trying to appear calm and non-threatening. The cubs stared at him. Minutes passed. Jack's legs started to ache from sitting still, but he did not move. 15 minutes, 20, 30. His back was getting stiff and he was starting to think this would not work. The cubs were just too scared, too traumatized. They would never trust him enough. Then Pip stood up. The little cub swayed slightly, exhaustion making him unsteady. He took one small step toward Jack, then another. Scout and Ember watched their sibling, their ears forward with interest. Pip kept moving slowly, carefully, until he reached the edge of the blanket. The cub's small nose twitched, testing Jack's scent. Jack held his breath. He wanted to reach out to encourage Pip, but he knew that would be the wrong move. He had to let the cub decide. Pip stepped onto the blanket. The warmth seemed to please him. He walked in a small circle, then curled up near Jack's leg. The cub was so small, so fragile. Jack could feel the tiny body trembling against him. Scout was next. The middle cub approached more cautiously, taking longer to build up courage. But eventually Scout joined Pip on the blanket, settling down on the other side. Ember held out the longest. The largest cub sat in the corner, watching her siblings with an expression that seemed almost disapproving. But after several minutes, she too gave in to exhaustion and curiosity. She walked over and climbed onto the blanket, positioning herself between her brothers. The 3 cubs arranged themselves naturally, forming a small pile with each other. But this time they had something they did not have before. They had Jack sitting at the edge of their pile like a guardian. He was not a Kravik adult, but he was bigger than them and he was calm. Most importantly, he was there. For a long time, nothing happened. The cubs stayed tense, their eyes still open, their bodies ready to run at the first sign of danger. Jack remained perfectly still, controlling his breathing, trying to project safety and calm. His legs were going numb. His back ached terribly, but he did not move. Slowly, gradually, the cubs began to relax. Scout's eyes closed first, then opened again, then closed for longer. Ember's breathing deepened, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Pip made a small sound, something between a sigh and a chirp, and tucked his nose under his paw, and then finally they slept. Real sleep. not the fitful, half-conscious state they had been trapped in. Their bodies went limp. Their breathing synchronized, all three of them breathing together in a peaceful rhythm. They were so still that for a moment Jack worried something was wrong. But then Pip twitched in his sleep, his small paw moving as if chasing something in a dream. Jack felt tears in his eyes. He blinked them away, not wanting to disturb the cubs. They looked so peaceful, so content. This was what they had needed all along. Not fancy equipment or perfect environmental controls, just the simple presence of someone watching over them, telling them without words that they were safe. 6 hours passed. Jack did not move the entire time. His body screamed in protest, muscles cramping, joints stiff. But he stayed where he was, barely breathing, watching the cubs sleep. He memorized every detail, the way Ember's ear twitched occasionally, the soft sounds Pip made, the rise and fall of Scout's chest. When they finally woke, the change was remarkable. Their eyes were brighter, more alert. They stretched and yawned, showing tiny fangs. Then they did something that made Jack's heart soar. They played. Scout pounced on Pip, and the two rolled across the floor in a playful wrestling match. Ember watched for a moment, then joined in, batting at her brothers with soft paws. It was the first time Jack had seen them act like normal, healthy cubs. The first time they had enough energy to play. He stood up carefully, his legs barely supporting him after sitting still for so long. The cubs stopped playing and looked at him. Then, to his surprise, they ran over to him. They rubbed against his legs, chirping and purring. It was clear they were saying thank you in their own way. Helen arrived an hour later to do her daily check. Her eyes widened when she saw the cubs playing energetically. She ran her scans, checking their vitals. Then she looked at Jack with amazement. "What did you do?" "Their stress hormones have dropped by 70%. Their immune function is already recovering." Jack explained what had happened, showing her the thermal blanket. Helen listened carefully, nodding as he spoke. When he finished, she smiled. "It makes sense. You provided what they needed. A safe space and a guardian presence. You fooled their instincts into thinking they had pack protection. Can I do it again?" Jack asked. "Tonight, I mean. Will it keep working?" Helen looked at the cubs, who were now investigating a piece of equipment with curious sniffs. "I think you will have to. They have bonded with you, Jack. For better or worse, you are their guardian now. They will expect you every night." Jack looked at the three cubs and felt a weight settle on his shoulders. It was a responsibility he had not planned on, a commitment that would take over his life. But as he watched Pip chase his tail and Scout climb on top of a crate, he knew he would not have it any other way. These cubs needed him, and somehow he needed them too. The blanket ritual became part of the daily routine. Every evening, as the ship's lights dimmed to simulate night, Jack would arrive at the cargo hold with the thermal blanket. The cubs learned to recognize the pattern. They would wait near the door, their tails swishing with anticipation. When Jack entered, they would chirp and rush to greet him, rubbing against his legs and climbing on his feet. Jack would sit down and spread the blanket. The cubs no longer hesitated. They climbed on immediately, arranging themselves in their den pile with practiced ease. Pip always took the spot closest to Jack's leg. Scout preferred the middle, where he could keep an eye on everything. Ember settled at the edge, forming the outer barrier of their small group. Within minutes, they would be asleep, breathing in peaceful unison. The cubs grew stronger each day. Their fur became shiny and soft. Their eyes sparkled with health and curiosity. They gained weight, their small bodies filling out properly. Dr. Helen was amazed at their progress. She had never seen such a dramatic recovery in any species, much less one as complex as the Kravik. During the day, the cubs followed Jack everywhere he went in the cargo hold. They watched him work, their heads tilting when he spoke to himself or made notes on his computer. They brought him things, small objects they found interesting, a loose bolt, a piece of plastic wrapping, a dust cover from some equipment. Jack learned that this was their way of sharing, of including him in their pack. One day, Scout brought him something different. It was a small piece of cloth torn from some packing material. The cub laid it at Jack's feet and sat down, looking up at him expectantly. Jack picked up the cloth and examined it. It was nothing special, just a scrap. But to Scout, it was important enough to present like a gift. "Thank you, Scout," Jack said, keeping the cloth. The cub's ears perked up at the sound of his name. Scout chirped happily and ran back to his siblings. Jack realized something important in that moment. The cubs were not just tolerating him. They were accepting him as part of their family. In their minds, he was Pack. The crew of the Wanderer started to change their attitudes too. At first, they had been nervous about having Kravik cubs on board. But it was hard to stay afraid when you watched them play. Greg, the engineer who had been so reluctant at first, started stopping by the cargo hold during his breaks. He would stand at the window, watching the cubs wrestle and chase each other. Sometimes Jack caught him smiling. Lieutenant Karen Boyd visited once a week to check on the situation. She always maintained her professional demeanor, asking practical questions about resources and safety protocols. But Jack noticed that her visits lasted longer each time. She would linger at the window, watching the cubs with an expression that was almost soft. Once, when Pip fell during a game and let out a distressed squeak, Karen actually gasped. She caught herself quickly, but Jack had seen her concern. Jack began to study the cubs' vocalizations more carefully. He recorded their sounds and played them back, analyzing the patterns. With help from Claire Martinez, the ship's linguist, he started to understand their communication system. It was not language exactly, but it was complex. Different chirps meant different things. A high-pitched trill meant excitement. A low rumble was contentment. A sharp yowl indicated fear or pain. Armed with this knowledge, Jack began responding appropriately to their signals. When they chirped for food, he brought it immediately. When they yowled at a sudden noise, he came to comfort them, speaking in soothing tones. The cubs learned that their communications had meaning, that they could affect their environment through their voices. It made them more confident, more secure. They also started to understand his words, at least some of them. Their names were the first breakthrough. When Jack said Pip, the smallest cub would look at him immediately. Scout would turn his head at the sound of his name. Ember would stop what she was doing and focus her attention on Jack. It was basic, but it was communication, a bridge between their species. 3 weeks after the cubs arrived, the ship received a message from the Kravik Dominion. Jack was in his quarters when Karen called him to the bridge. Her voice over the intercom was careful, neutral. The tone told him everything he needed to know before she even explained. The Kravik authorities had been located and informed. A military vessel called the Talon's Edge was being dispatched to retrieve the cubs. They would arrive in 4 days. The message from the Kravik commander was formal and brief. They acknowledged the human crew's assistance but made it clear that the cubs were to be transferred immediately upon arrival. Jack stood on the bridge reading the message on the screen. He should have felt relieved. This was what he had been working toward, keeping the cubs alive and healthy until their people could come for them. The mission was almost complete. The cubs would go home to their own kind where they belonged, but he did not feel relieved. He felt sad, a deep ache in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. In just 3 weeks, these cubs had become important to him. He looked forward to seeing them each day. He worried about them when he was away. He found himself thinking about them during his other work, wondering what they were doing, if they were happy. 4 days, Karen said quietly. She was watching him, her expression understanding. I know this is not easy, Jack, but it is the right thing. They need to be with their own kind. Jack nodded. I know, you are right. I just did not expect to feel like this. They are special, Karen admitted. I have watched them grow stronger because of what you did. You should be proud of that. That evening, when Jack came to the cargo hold with the blanket, the cubs seemed to sense something was wrong. They did not greet him with their usual enthusiasm. Instead, they approached slowly, cautiously. Pip walked right up to him and placed both front paws on Jack's knee, looking up into his face. The small cub's expression was worried. Jack sat down and spread the blanket, but his heart was heavy. The cubs climbed on, but they stayed closer to him than usual. Pip pressed right against Jack's leg as close as possible. Scout draped himself half across Jack's lap. Even Ember, who usually maintained some independence, moved in close. They formed their den pile, but it was tighter, more clingy than before. As the cubs settled into sleep, Jack found himself memorizing everything about this moment. The weight of their small bodies, the softness of their fur under his hand, the gentle sounds of their breathing, the warmth they created together under the blanket. He wanted to remember it all, every detail, because soon it would be just a memory. The next 3 days passed too quickly. The cubs became more clingy with each passing hour. They did not want Jack to leave the cargo hold. When he tried to go, they would follow him to the door, mewing sadly. Pip was the worst. The little cub would grab onto Jack's pant leg with his claws, holding on as if he could prevent Jack from leaving. Jack found himself spending almost all his time with them. He brought his work to the cargo hold and did it there while the cubs played around him. He ate his meals there. He only left for absolutely necessary tasks, and even then he hurried back as quickly as possible. The cubs seemed to understand that something was ending, even if they did not know what. On the fourth day, the Talon's edge appeared on the sensors. It was a massive ship, much larger than the Wanderer, sleek and powerful. Jack watched it approach on the cargo hold's small monitor. His hands were shaking slightly. The cubs sat around him, all three watching the screen as if they understood what it meant. Karen's voice came over the intercom. "Jack, they are requesting permission to board. The delegation will be here in 30 minutes. Jack acknowledged the message. Then he looked down at the three cubs. They were so much bigger than when he first found them. Healthier, stronger, more confident. He had done his job well. They would be fine with their own people. They would grow up among other Kravik, learning their culture and traditions. It was the best possible outcome. So why did it feel like his heart was breaking? He gathered the cubs close, all three of them pressing against him. He spoke to them quietly, telling them things they could not understand but that he needed to say anyway. He told them they were brave and strong. He told them they would have good lives. He told them he would never forget them. The cubs listened, their large eyes fixed on his face as if they were trying to understand every word. When the 30 minutes were up, Jack stood. The cubs stood with him, staying close. Together, they waited for the Kravik delegation to arrive. Jack did not know what would happen next, but he knew that whatever came, these three cubs had changed him forever. They had taught him something important about connection, about care, about what it meant to be responsible for another life. He would carry that lesson with him always, long after they were gone. The Kravik delegation entered the ship with the confidence of warriors. There were 3 of them, each one massive and imposing. They towered over the human crew members, their fur marked with patterns that indicated military rank. Their movements were graceful but carried an edge of danger, like predators walking among prey. The leader was named Commander Vex Thornmane. He was taller than the others, with silver streaks in his dark fur that spoke of age and experience. His eyes were golden, sharp, and intelligent. When he looked at the humans, it felt like he could see right through them, reading their thoughts and intentions. His voice was deep and carried authority. The meeting took place in the conference room. Lieutenant Karen Boyd represented the crew, with Jack standing beside her. Commander Thornmane sat across from them, his 2 companions flanking him like guards. The atmosphere was tense. The Kravik commander's questions came fast and sharp. How long have the cubs been aboard your vessel? What methods did you use to care for them? What food did you provide? Were they handled roughly at any point? Each question carried an undercurrent of suspicion, as if Commander Thornmane expected to find that the humans had done something wrong. Jack understood. The Kravik were protective of their young, and they had every reason to be cautious when dealing with another species. But it still stung a bit, the implication that they might have harmed the cubs. Jack provided detailed answers to each question. He showed medical reports from Dr. Helen, nutrition logs, environmental control records. He explained everything they had done, every decision they had made. Commander Thornmane reviewed each document carefully, occasionally speaking to his companions in the Kravik language. The rapid-fire sounds of their speech were like nothing Jack had ever heard, musical and harsh at the same time. Finally, Commander Thornmane closed the last report and looked directly at Jack. "We wish to see the cubs immediately." Karen nodded and stood. "Of course, follow us." The walk to the cargo hold felt too short. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of separation. He tried to prepare himself, but how could you prepare for something like this? The cubs had become part of his daily life, as natural as breathing. Letting them go would leave a hole that nothing else could fill. When they entered the cargo hold, the cubs were playing. Scout had found a piece of rope and was trying to pull it away from Ember, who had it clamped firmly in her jaws. Pip was attempting to climb on top of a storage crate, his small claws scrabbling for purchase. At the sound of the door opening, all 3 cubs froze. They saw the adult Kravik and went perfectly still. Jack expected them to run forward, to recognize their own species and seek their protection. But instead, something unexpected happened. The cubs turned and bolted toward Jack. They scrambled to reach him, their small paws sliding on the smooth floor in their haste. When they reached him, they pressed against his legs, hiding behind him, peering out at the Kravik warriors with wide, fearful eyes. Jack heard one of the Kravik warriors make a surprised sound. Commander Thornmane's expression was unreadable, but his ears tilted forward with interest. He stepped closer slowly, lowering his large body to appear less threatening. He spoke to the cubs in the Kravik language, his deep voice surprisingly gentle. The words were soft, coaxing. The cubs did not respond. They pressed closer to Jack, and Pip grabbed onto his pant leg with small claws. Scout made a small whimpering sound. Ember's tail puffed up, making her look larger, a defensive reaction. Commander Thornmane straightened and turned his golden gaze on Jack. The intensity of that stare was almost physical. Jack forced himself to meet the commander's eyes, even though every instinct told him to look away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Commander Thornmane spoke, his words careful and deliberate. "How did you earn their trust?" Jack took a breath. He explained everything, starting from the first night when he realized the cubs could not sleep. He described the research he had done, the paper about den sleep, the idea to use the thermal blanket. He told the commander about the first time the cubs had climbed onto the blanket, how they had finally relaxed enough to truly rest. He explained the nightly ritual, how it had become essential to their health and happiness. As Jack spoke, Commander Thornmane listened with complete attention. His ears were forward, catching every word. When Jack finished, the commander was quiet for a moment. Then he made a request that surprised everyone in the room. "I wish to see this ritual. Show me what you do." Jack glanced at Karen, who gave a small nod. It was not evening yet, not the usual time, but the cubs would recognize the blanket regardless. Jack went to the storage locker and retrieved it. The moment the cubs saw the thermal blanket, their entire demeanor changed. The fear disappeared, replaced by excitement. They began to chirp and circle around Jack's legs, just like they did every evening. Jack sat down on the floor and spread the blanket across his lap. The cubs needed no encouragement. They climbed on immediately, each taking their familiar position. Pip pressed against Jack's leg. Scout settled in the middle. Ember formed the outer edge. They arranged themselves with the ease of long practice, creating their small den pile with Jack as their guardian. The Kravik warriors watched in complete silence. Jack could feel their eyes on him, but he focused on the cubs. He rested his hand gently on Scout's back, the touch light and reassuring. The cubs began to relax almost immediately. Their muscles loosened, their breathing slowed. Pip yawned, showing tiny fangs, then tucked his nose under his paw. Within minutes, all three cubs were asleep. Real sleep, deep and peaceful. Their small bodies rose and fell with synchronized breathing. Ember's paw twitched as she dreamed. Scout made a soft chirping sound in his sleep. Pip was completely limp, utterly relaxed. Commander Thornmane observed for a long time. He walked around Jack and the cubs slowly, studying them from different angles. His expression was thoughtful, calculating. Finally he spoke, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before. "Respect. You have done what I would not have thought possible. You gave them den sleep without pack bond. This is a difficult thing, even for our own kind to achieve with orphaned cubs. Many of our carers struggle with it for weeks. You managed it in days." Jack did not know what to say. He simply kept his hand on Scout's back, maintaining the stillness that the cubs needed. Commander Thornmane returned to stand in front of him. The commander's golden eyes were no longer suspicious. They were thoughtful, assessing Jack in a new way. "The cubs have bonded with you. Separating them abruptly would cause distress, possibly undo their progress." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Would you be willing to accompany them to Kravik space, at least for the transition period? You would be compensated for your time and treated as an honored guest." The question hung in the air. Jack's mind raced. Leave the Wanderer? Leave his research position? His contract still had 8 months remaining. Leaving now could damage his career, make it harder to find work in the future. It was asking a lot to give up everything he had planned. But then he looked down at the cubs sleeping peacefully under his protection. He thought about Pip grabbing onto his leg, afraid to let go. He thought about Scout bringing him gifts every day. He thought about Ember's fierce independence and how even she had learned to trust him. These cubs had given him their trust completely. Could he really abandon them now? Before Jack could answer, Karen spoke up. I formally release Mr. Harper from his contract, effective immediately. His work with the Kravik cubs represents a significant contribution to interspecies relations. It should be recognized and supported. Jack looked at Karen in surprise. She met his gaze steadily, and he saw understanding in her eyes. She knew what his answer would be. She was making it easier for him. Jack turned back to Commander Thornmain. I accept. I will come with you. The commander's ears tilted forward in what might have been approval. Good. We depart in 4 hours. Bring whatever you need. The cubs will remain with you during the journey. 4 hours later, Jack stood in the docking bay with a single bag of belongings. The crew had gathered to see him off. Greg shook his hand firmly, not quite meeting his eyes. Helen hugged him, whispering that he should take care of himself. Claire gave him a small device loaded with language files, telling him it might help him learn Kravik faster. Karen was the last to say goodbye. She stood straight and formal, but her voice was softer than usual. You did good work here, Jack. Those cubs are alive because of you. Do not forget that. Thank you, Jack said. For everything. For understanding, Karen nodded. Take care of them, and take care of yourself. Jack picked up his bag and walked toward the airlock where the cubs waited. They saw him coming and began to chirp excitedly. He was not leaving them after all. They did not understand where they were going or what would happen next. They only knew that their guardian was staying with them. And for now, that was enough. The Talon's Edge was different from any ship Jack had ever been on. Everything was built on a massive scale. The corridors were wide enough for 3 Kravik to walk side by side. The ceilings were so high that Jack felt like a child walking through a building designed for giants. Even the doors were twice as tall as necessary for him, made for beings much larger than humans. The cubs were fascinated by the new environment. They explored every corner of the quarters assigned to Jack, sniffing and investigating with boundless curiosity. The rooms were spacious with high windows that looked out into space. There was a main living area, a sleeping alcove, and a small food preparation space. Everything was designed for Kravik proportions, which meant Jack had to climb onto chairs to reach surfaces that would be waist-high for the crew. The Kravik crew members were initially distant. They watched Jack with the same golden-eyed intensity that seemed universal to their species. Some stared openly, their expressions unreadable. Jack could not tell if they were curious, suspicious, or simply observing. He tried to smile and nod when he passed them in the corridors, but most did not respond. But that began to change as days passed. The crew members would stop to watch when Jack brought the cubs to the observation deck. They would stand at a distance pretending to work on equipment or check displays, but their eyes followed the cubs. Jack caught them watching when Pip wrestled with Scout, or when Ember practiced pouncing on imaginary prey. Sometimes he saw expressions soften, just for a moment before the warriors remembered their composure. The blanket ritual continued every evening. Jack maintained the routine exactly as it had been on the Wanderer. The cubs needed that consistency, that predictable pattern. When the ship's lights dimmed to simulate night, Jack would spread the thermal blanket and the cubs would arrange themselves in their familiar positions. Within minutes, they would be asleep, breathing in peaceful unison. One evening, Jack looked up from the sleeping cubs to find Commander Thornmain standing in the doorway. The commander did not enter, just stood there watching silently. His expression was thoughtful, almost gentle. After a moment, he spoke quietly. You are good with them. Better than many of our trained carers. It is a rare gift. Jack kept his voice low to avoid disturbing the cubs. I just tried to understand what they needed. That is wisdom, Commander Thornmain said. Many beings see only what they want to see, not what truly is. You looked beyond species and saw need. That is why they trust you. The commander left without saying anything more. But after that conversation, Jack noticed a shift in how the crew treated him. They began to nod when he passed. A few even spoke to him, teaching him simple Kravik phrases. One warrior, a female named Kira Swiftclaw, started stopping by to check on the cubs. She would bring small treats, pieces of specialized food designed for young Kravik. The cubs learned to recognize her and would chirp happily when she arrived. Commander Thornmain spent time with Jack most days, teaching him about Kravik culture. He explained that orphaned cubs were raised by what they called the clan collective, where multiple families shared responsibility. It was considered an honor to care for cubs who had lost their parents. These cubs would be well provided for, given the best training and education the Kravik could offer. But there would be expectations too. The cubs would need to prove themselves worthy of the resources invested in them. They would train as warriors, learn the arts of hunting and combat. Kravik society valued strength, skill, and honor above all else. The cubs would grow up in a demanding environment, one that would shape them into formidable adults. Jack worried about that sometimes. Would the cubs remember kindness in a culture built on strength? Would they remember the peaceful nights under the blanket when they became fierce hunters? But then he would watch them play, see the joy in their eyes, and trust that what they learned now would stay with them always. 2 weeks into the journey, they approached Kravik space. Jack stood at the observation window with the cubs, watching as their homeworld came into view. Kravos Prime was beautiful, a planet of deep greens and blues covered in vast forests and mountain ranges. Cities were visible from orbit, but they blended into the landscape rather than dominating it. The Kravik had built their civilization to work with nature, not against it. The cubs pressed against the window, their eyes wide. Did they recognize something instinctive? Did some part of them know this was home? Jack could not tell, but they seemed excited, chirping and bouncing with energy. The landing was smooth. When they stepped out of the ship, Jack felt the warm air of Kravos Prime on his face. It smelled different from any place he had been before, rich with scents of growing things and distant rain. The spaceport was massive, built into the side of a mountain. Structures carved from living rock rose around them, beautiful and functional at the same time. A delegation was waiting. Dozens of Kravik, many of them elderly with silver fur and wise eyes. They gathered around the cubs, examining them carefully, speaking in rapid Kravik. Medical specialists scanned the cubs with devices Jack did not recognize. Clan mothers touched them gently, checking their fur and teeth and paws. Through it all, the cubs kept returning to Jack, seeking reassurance. The elders noticed. They spoke among themselves in low voices, glancing between Jack and the cubs. Jack could not understand their words, but he could read body language well enough. They were discussing him, debating something important. That evening, Jack was summoned to meet with the Council of Clans. Commander Thornmane accompanied him, which was somewhat reassuring. The council chamber was carved from a massive cave, with natural formations creating tiers where the elders sat. Hundreds of Kravik filled the space, all watching as Jack walked to the center. He felt very small and very alone. The eldest council member was called Matriarch Sira Nightwhisper. Her fur was almost entirely silver, and her eyes held the weight of many years. When she spoke, her voice filled the chamber despite its gentle tone. She spoke in English clearly and carefully so Jack could understand. "Jack Harper, you have done something remarkable. You saved 3 cubs when they should have died. You earned their trust across species boundaries. You gave them the care they needed without understanding our ways. This shows great compassion and wisdom." Jack did not know if he should respond, so he simply bowed his head respectfully. The matriarch continued. "We wish to offer you a position here as cultural liaison and xenobiologist. More than that, we ask that you continue your role in the cubs' lives. In our culture, those who save a life become bonded to it. By saving these cubs, you have become what we call Den Guardian. You are responsible for their well-being." The words hung in the air. Jack's mind raced. A permanent position on Kravik homeworld? Continuing to care for the cubs? It was beyond anything he had imagined. He thought about Earth, about family and friends light years away. He thought about the career he had planned, the research he wanted to do. But then he thought about 3 small faces looking up at him with complete trust. The matriarch seemed to understand his hesitation. "You may have the night to consider. This is not a decision to be made lightly." Jack was given quarters overlooking one of the great forests. He sat on the balcony as night fell, watching the twin moons rise over the alien landscape. The air was warm and filled with sounds he did not recognize, calls of creatures moving through the darkness. It was beautiful and strange and utterly foreign. He thought about everything that had led him here. A chance discovery of a derelict ship, 3 terrified cubs, sleepless nights trying to help them, a simple blanket that became a bridge between species. Every choice had brought him to this moment, standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. But really, was there even a choice? The decision had been made weeks ago. The first time Pip climbed onto that blanket and fell asleep against his leg. The first time Scout brought him a gift. The first time Ember trusted him enough to close her eyes. The cubs needed him, and somehow he needed them too. The next morning, Jack returned to the council chamber. He stood before the assembled elders and spoke clearly. "I accept your offer. I will stay." The ceremony that followed was conducted in ancient Kravik, words Jack could not understand but felt the weight of. He was formally adopted into Clan Thornmane under Commander Vex's sponsorship. He became Den Guardian Jack Harper, protector of Pip, Scout, and Ember, and the first human to be granted clan membership in Kravik society. Years passed. The cubs grew into strong young Kravik, training in warrior traditions. They learned to hunt, to fight, to survive. But every evening, no matter how old they became or how fierce, they still came to Jack's quarters. And every evening he spread out that same thermal blanket, now worn and patched from years of use. They were too large now to fit comfortably on the blanket. Pip alone was nearly as tall as Jack, with muscles that could easily overpower a human. But they made it work, arranging themselves in their familiar den pile with Jack as their guardian. Their breathing synchronized as they fell asleep, just as it had that first night. Jack had become something of a legend in Kravik society. The human who understood what the cubs needed when words failed. The one who showed that bonds of care could transcend species. Other humans followed his example, taking positions within Kravik Spasi,